The rain soaked through wool coats as generals scribbled over maps with all the confidence of men who'd never set foot in mud. In their minds, it would be a quick campaign, full of waving flags and cheering crowds. They'd be back by Christmas, and with a few medals and a good story. What they got was a continent-wide meat grinder. Uh-oh, these are the biggest idiots of World War I. For our first crown jewel of catastrophe, let's start with a moment that helped kick off World War I. It was a tense morning on June 28, 1914, and Archduke Franz Ferdinand was being chauffeured through the city of Sarajevo, inspecting imperial troops and making a political appearance on behalf of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The day had already gone off script once, thanks to an earlier assassination attempt, but the real disaster was still waiting for him, just around the corner. Of course, being the heir to the throne, the Archduke wasn't exactly riding solo. In his open-top car were his wife Sophie and several guards, while the rest of the motorcade followed close behind. Following protocol, they were supposed to avoid crowds and stick to a modified route after the morning's attack. The only issue? Nobody told the drivers. While en route, the procession made its way down Apple Quay, sticking to the old plan instead of the new one. The Archduke's driver, Leopold Moltke, was supposed to turn onto a side street to avoid a busy intersection. Instead, he took a hard right onto Franz Josef Street, completely unaware what was about to happen. Within seconds, the car stalled, and by pure coincidence or historical cruelty, it came to a stop right in front of Gavrilo Princip, the man who had just failed to kill the Archduke earlier that morning. The first few moments were probably surreal. Everything looked like it was going to continue as planned, and then Moltke slammed the brakes. He made the wrong turn. You can imagine the panic on his face as he realized the car wasn't moving. And there, just feet away, stood a man holding a pistol. Princip stepped forward and fired twice, killing the Archduke and his wife at point-blank range. Panic swept through the street. They only had seconds to respond, but there was no protection from that range. At first, some guards tried to jump between the royals and the shooter, but they reacted too late. Then there was a wave of chaos as the crowd screamed and scattered. By this point, the damage had already been done, and all anyone could do was arrest Princip and try to restore order to a city that had just ignited a global crisis. Franz Ferdinand died within minutes. Sophie died almost instantly. In the hours that followed, the news spread like wildfire. The Austro-Hungarian Empire blamed Serbia for harboring the assassins. Within weeks, declarations of war were issued, alliances activated, and the July crisis plunged Europe into one of the deadliest wars in human history. More than 20 million people would die before it was over. Meanwhile, Leopold Moltke, the man who made the wrong turn, survived the war and lived until 1926. In the aftermath, history didn't charge him with murder or treason, but his mistake may be the most catastrophic wrong turn ever made behind the wheel. One bad GPS moment and boom, welcome to the war to end all wars. As we've seen, there are lots of contenders for history's biggest idiots, but our next one steered an empire straight into isolation. Wilhelm II was the grandson of Queen Victoria and the last German emperor, ruling the German Empire from 1888 to 1918. Early in his reign, he liked to give loud speeches and play soldier, but behind the saber-rattling and naval uniforms, there was a dangerously inflated ego. By the time of the July crisis in 1914, he had pushed away almost every ally Germany had, except the one that would drag him into war. When Wilhelm dismissed Chancellor Otto von Bismarck in 1890, he took it as a chance to pursue his own vision for Germany. At the time, the empire was already a dominant force on the continent, but Wilhelm wanted it to be a global power. To prove that Germany belonged on the world stage, he built a navy to rival Britain's. He issued reckless public statements and handed Austria-Hungary a blank check for whatever came next. The idea was to secure German dominance. What he got was an arms race, a collapsing diplomatic web, and a two-front war. Obviously, France and Russia noticed what was happening, so they strengthened their own ties in response. When Austria sent Serbia a list of impossible demands in July 1914, Germany backed them unconditionally. But Wilhelm still thought he could scare everyone into backing down. The thing is, though, Russia wasn't bluffing, and France was treaty-bound to follow. When the Austro-Hungarians declared war, the dominoes began to fall. Britain joined to protect Belgium, and suddenly Wilhelm had managed to unite the Triple Entente against him. Through a combination of arrogance, insecurity, and diplomatic incompetence, Wilhelm had engineered a situation in which Germany was completely surrounded. In August 1914, he watched from Berlin as German troops surged into Belgium and France, hoping for a quick knockout. But within weeks, the front froze, trenches dug in, and the war he thought would be over by Christmas began devouring a generation. In other words, within a month, the Kaiser's dream of German glory had already died. Because he couldn't reverse the course, the years that followed only deepened the hole. The British blockade starved civilians, the Eastern Front drained manpower, and on the home front, morale collapsed. Over the course of 4 years, more than 2 million Germans were killed and the empire bled itself dry. Meanwhile, Wilhelm spent most of the war issuing delusional proclamations and deferring real decisions to his generals. By November 1918, revolution had broken out, and the Kaiser was forced to abdicate and flee to the Netherlands. Increasingly irrelevant and ridiculed, he lived out his days in exile, chopping wood and reminiscing about the empire he lost. His actions didn't just cost Germany the war, they helped make sure it couldn't win in the first place. He never stood trial, he never returned, but his blunders haunted Europe for decades to come. This leads us to a truth that historians don't debate. Wilhelm wanted to play emperor, but couldn't manage a treaty. He fanned the flames, then ran from the fire. Maybe you've heard the phrase, lions led by donkeys. If you haven't, you soon will. Since the dawn of organized warfare, there have been commanders so out of touch, so tragically overconfident, that you wonder how they made it out of officer school. In modern terminology, we'd refer to this special breed of self-important disaster men as legacy hires, which brings us to General Douglas Haig. Before World War I, he had already carved out a neat little career for himself in Britain's colonial military apparatus. He served in Sudan, in South Africa, and at staff colleges, where he gained a reputation for being ambitious, methodical, and above all else, conventional. Naturally, that landed him in charge of the British Expeditionary Force. But there was just one problem. Douglas Haig had no grasp of modern war. By 1915, he had risen to Commander-in-Chief of British forces on the Western Front, a position of enormous responsibility at a time when the war was shifting into brutal trench warfare. Germany had machine guns, concrete bunkers, poison gas, and high ground. So what did Douglas Haig do with this information? He launched offensive like it was 1812. Between 1916 and 1917, while the French dealt with mutinies and the Russians began collapsing, Haig pushed the British into a series of catastrophic battles, most infamously the Somme and the Passchendaele. Yeah, you heard that right, Somme and Passchendaele, and both were absolute meat grinders. You see, Haig's strategy was to keep attacking until the enemy gave out, and the enemy never gave out because his offensives were straight suicide. One of Britain's key war aims was to break the German line and relieve pressure on the French, but in his infinite wisdom, the British bulldog chose to do it across open fields, covered in mud, barbed wire, and machine gun nests. Not only did he underestimate German defenses, but he also overestimated his own artillery, which failed to destroy enemy positions before the infantry went in. Oh yeah, and he believed cavalry would be useful. Cavalry in 1916. Some say the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. But this could easily apply to sheer military stupidity as well. Wave after wave of British soldiers were told to march across no man's land as if morale alone could stop a bullet. On the first day of the Somme alone, there were 57,000 British casualties. Only a handful of small gains were made, and when it all went to hell, Haig blamed the weather, he blamed his subordinates, and he even blamed the soldiers themselves. Convinced that fighting spirit was more important than firepower, he just kept doubling down. The irony, though, was that Haig never once visited the front line during the worst of the fighting. His next disaster class was Passchendaele in 1917. For months, men drowned in mud as shells rained down and horses sank beneath the swampy terrain. The British advanced just a few miles at a cost of over 250,000 lives. By the end of the war, Haig was still in command, somehow knighted and honored, but remembered by many as the man who turned courage into cannon fodder. His legacy may be complicated, but his tactics were not. They were idiotic. Before revolution erased his crown forever, Russian Emperor Nicholas II had been a beloved symbol of imperial tradition, ruling by divine right in a realm that worshipped the monarchy as sacred. But the naive and detached Nicholas, who saw governance as a moral duty passed down from God rather than a job requiring skill, was in no way prepared for the modern world. He was, according to one British diplomat, quoting here, a man of limited intelligence and no leadership instincts, overwhelmed by his role and clinging to outdated ideas. In the year 1915, while his generals struggled to hold the Eastern Front, Nicholas received news that the army had suffered another major setback against German forces. In response, the inexperienced Tsar decided to take direct command of the Russian military, believing that his presence alone would boost morale and turn the tide of the war. Convinced that loyalty to the throne was stronger than logistics or strategy, Nicholas left the capital and installed himself at military headquarters, like he was embarking on a spiritual retreat. What Nicholas didn't realize was that he was marching straight into a catastrophe engineered by his own incompetence and the crumbling machinery of his empire. Influenced heavily by his wife Alexandra, herself under the spell of the mystic Rasputin, he ignored warnings from ministers and generals that his absence from Petrograd would create a dangerous power vacuum. In a kingdom already stretched to its limits by food shortages, inflation, and political unrest, the Tsar's departure was a fatal miscalculation. But then, a series of revolts back home began to expose just how fragile his rule really was. Loyal advisors and members of the Duma reportedly warned Nicholas that the people were starving, the soldiers were mutinous, and the government was paralyzed by corruption. But the Tsarist court simply dismissed these concerns as exaggerations from malcontents or revolutionaries. Accompanied by a shrinking band of loyal officers, Nicholas remained secluded in his headquarters, cut off from reality and increasingly isolated from the empire he was supposed to rule. Suddenly, his generals stopped sending orders, and all at once, Petrograd erupted into chaos. At the same time, riots broke out in the capital. Striking workers flooded the streets, and garrisons refused to fire on the crowds. Then a provisional government declared itself in control, stripping the monarchy of its remaining authority. Nicholas tried to issue commands, but no one listened. He attempted to return to the capital, but the railways were blocked and the army had turned. Knowing the dynasty was finished, Nicholas signed an abdication letter on March 15, 1917, relinquishing the throne to his brother, who said He refused it the next day. As the empire imploded, Nicholas and his family were placed under house arrest. In July 1918, they were executed by the Bolsheviks in a basement in Yekaterinburg. Their bodies were thrown into a shallow grave. He had tried to preserve the sacred order of Tsarist Russia by clinging to myth and prayer. But the storm came anyway, and Nicholas lost everything, including his own life, in the wreckage. What do you think of when you hear the name military genius? If this brings to mind lightning-fast maneuvers and devastating victories, then you're probably thinking of someone like Napoleon or Hannibal. But when the name Helmuth von Moltke the Younger comes up, you should be thinking about bureaucratic panic and vague orders and a strategic belly flop so bad it dragged Europe into 4 years of trench warfare. Appointed chief of the German General Staff in 1906, Moltke inherited a bold and rigid plan. By 1914, he had watered it down, bungled its execution, and doomed Germany to a war it couldn't win. With this in mind, this makes Moltke's decision-making in August 1914 all the more baffling. The original Schlieffen Plan, drafted years earlier, relied on overwhelming force in the west to knock France out quickly before turning east to face Russia. However, instead of following it to the letter, Moltke weakened the vital right flank that was supposed to sweep through Belgium and encircle Paris. He diverted troops to the east and to defend Alsace, diluting the only part of the plan that actually mattered. And if that wasn't bad enough, he had no backup plan in case it failed. German High Command had committed itself to the strategy like it was a legal contract. But being the cautious bureaucrat he was, Moltke started making adjustments mid-invasion. He didn't communicate well with his field commanders, he didn't account for stiff Belgian resistance, and he definitely didn't plan for the British to arrive so fast. So when the German army started grinding to a halt on the outskirts of Paris, there was no masterstroke waiting in the wings, just chaos. The old saying goes that no plan survives first contact with the enemy, and in this case, the plan didn't even survive contact with Moltke. The German advance was slowed by logistical breakdowns, rail bottlenecks, and overstretched supply lines. At the same time, the French regrouped. British enforcements dug in, and Paris started flooding troops to the front in taxis. By September, the Germans were being pushed back at the Marne, and Moltke, despondent and reportedly on the verge of collapse, handed off responsibility to a deputy. It was a total unraveling. What followed was the systematic burial of Moltke's legacy under mud and misery. The German army dug in, and so did the Allies. What was supposed to be a 6-week sprint turned into a 4-year quagmire. To give a sense of scale, the Western Front stretched hundreds of miles and consumed millions of lives. When Berlin finally reviewed the failure, the consensus was clear. Moltke had broken the Schlieffen Plan, and in doing so had broken Germany's best shot at a quick victory. In the end, he was quietly dismissed and replaced. He died in 1916, 2 years into the war he had helped botch. In total, his timid leadership and disastrous improvisations led to a stalemate that defined World War I. And that's the generous take. It was the winter of 1915, and Winston Churchill was sitting in the Admiralty, scanning maps and looking for a way to break the deadlock in Europe. The Western Front was locked in trench warfare, Russia was bleeding manpower in the east, and Britain needed a bold idea. The answer, at least according to Churchill, lay in the Dardanelles. By forcing a naval route through the Ottoman Empire, he hoped to knock the Turks out of the war, resupply the Russians, and pressure Germany from the south. Of course, as First Lord of the Admiralty, Churchill had the authority to make waves, literally. Commanding the Royal Navy and backed by the War Council, he ordered a massive fleet to sail into the narrow straits separating Europe from Asia. The plan was to bombard Turkish forts, sweep for mines, and sail straight through to Istanbul. Since the Ottomans were seen as the weakest of the Central Powers, the assumption was that they'd collapse under pressure. While planning the campaign, Winston Churchill, who was never short on confidence, pushed for immediate action. The initial naval bombardments began in February. Allied ships pounded the coastline for weeks, expecting the enemy to break. In fact, it looked so promising that he began preparing for landings. This would involve troops, mostly from Australia and New Zealand, storming the beaches and securing high ground. The key word here is securing. That part never happened. The first few landings seemed to proceed as expected. Everything looked like it was going to go by without a hitch, and then the troops hit the cliffs. They had been dropped at the wrong beaches, facing steep ridges and entrenched defenders and machine gun nests. You could imagine the horror on their faces as they waded ashore, only to be mowed down or trapped in the sand. The terrain had been underestimated, the defenses were far stronger than anticipated, and the Allies had no real backup plan. Chaos swept through the operation. They only had a narrow window to seize the objectives, but the landings were disorganized. At first, commanders tried to regroup and advance inland, but they ran into stiff resistance. Then they tried to dig in and hold ground. By this point, enough time had passed for Ottoman reinforcements to arrive. So what followed was a brutal stalemate, months of trench warfare on cliffs and beaches and gullies. Just like France, but with more flies and less cover. Winston Churchill remained determined. As setbacks piled up, he still believed the operation could succeed. In contrast, his political allies were growing uneasy. The casualty numbers were climbing. Morale was collapsing. It was said that every military report that crossed his desk was another nail in the campaign's coffin. Meanwhile, reinforcements kept arriving, only to die in the same killing zones. By the time the Allies finally evacuated in January 1916, it was too late to salvage anything. Over 250,000 men had been killed or wounded. Churchill resigned from the Admiralty and took a commission on the Western Front. In the aftermath, Gallipoli became a rallying point for the Anzac identity, but also a cautionary tale for military overreach. Churchill's legacy would recover in time, but his decisions during the Dardanelles campaign remain one of Britain's most infamous wartime blunders. A shortcut to victory that turned out to be a dead-end detour into disaster. What do you think of when you hear the word U-boat? If this very utterance makes you imagine black steel hulls slipping silently beneath the waves, hunting unsuspecting freighters, then you'd be pretty close to the truth. During World War I, Germany's Imperial Navy launched a fleet of submarines that stalked the Atlantic, sinking anything that looked like it might carry supplies to Britain. Some called it innovation, others called it madness. But either way, U-boat warfare became one of the most infamous military strategies of the entire war. At its peak, it brought Britain to the brink of starvation and pushed the United States into battle. With this in mind, this makes the decision to resume unrestricted submarine warfare in 1917 all the more baffling. The German Admiralty, led by figures like Henning von Holzendorf, knew full well what was at stake. Just 2 years earlier, the sinking of the RMS Lusitania, where 1,198 people were killed, including 128 Americans, had nearly dragged the U.S. into the war. In response, Germany had promised to restrict attacks on neutral ships. But by 1917, with the British blockade squeezing Germany's food supplies, the Navy convinced the Kaiser to break that promise. Germany was absolutely desperate, but being the strategic gamblers they were, the Naval Command claimed they could sink enough ships to cripple Britain before the U.S. could fully mobilize. Their logic? That merchant vessels were legitimate targets, even if they carried civilians. It was at this point that they made a decision of monumental recklessness. Instead of tightening the rules of engagement, they decided to torpedo first and ask questions never. The old saying goes that desperate times call for desperate measures, and in this case, the measure was wildly self-destructive. What followed was the systematic sinking of anything that floated toward British ports. To give a sense of scale, more than 850,000 tons of Allied shipping were destroyed in just 1 month, April 1917. American ships weren't spared, neither were Dutch, Norwegian, or Spanish vessels. When the final straw was reached, the United States declared war on Germany, sending fresh troops, money, and industrial might into the fight. When the decision was reviewed after the fact, the verdict was swift and brutal. The German Naval High Command had gambled that America would stay out. Man, were they wrong. They had hoped Britain would surrender. It did not. And by the time they realized the scale of this miscalculation, U.S. soldiers were landing in Europe at a rate of 10,000 a day. The same ships Germany had tried to sink were now ferrying men and material across the Atlantic with armed escorts. In the end, and fittingly, U-boat crews were hunted down by destroyers, death charged into oblivion as the tide turned. By 1918, the blockade on Germany had crippled its cities, and the Navy itself was in mutiny. In total, the decision to resume unrestricted submarine warfare led directly to the collapse of Germany's war effort and sealed its defeat. There's no way around it. The admirals tried to drown the British and ended up sinking themselves. These guys, and indeed all others on this list, were total idiots. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring the bell to stay up to date on all the nutty stories from humanity's past.